The glass shattered at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and Natalie Harlow's first thought wasn't fear. It was annoyance. She had specifically told building security to lock down floor access after 9. The penthouse on the 43rd floor of the Sentinel Tower in Boston's financial district was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of steel and bulletproof glass, where she could work through the night without interruption. She had 3 hours of financial documentation left to review before the board meeting in 9 days, and now someone had just put a brick through her window. Except it wasn't a brick. The figure that stepped through the shattered frame moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and how to avoid them. Natalie's hand went to the phone on her desk, but she never reached it. The wheelchair spun hard to the right as something struck the frame from behind, a calculated impact that sent her tilting sideways. She threw her arms out instinctively, catching herself against the mahogany desk, but the momentum was already working against her. The chair tipped past the point of recovery and she hit the marble floor face first, the air punching out of her lungs in one sharp exhalation. Her legs were useless. They had been useless for 11 years, ever since the drunk driver on I-90 had turned her from a 30-year-old CEO on the rise into a woman who had to relearn how to exist in a world built for people who could walk. She knew how to fall. She knew how to protect her head, how to absorb impact with her arms, how to keep breathing when the shock tried to shut her body down. What she didn't know was how to fight back against someone standing over her in the dark. The voice came from behind, calm and almost conversational. "Miss Harlow, we need to talk about the Orion files." Her mind raced through the possibilities. The Orion files were locked in an encrypted server that only 3 people in the world could access: herself, her personal attorney, and a forensic accountant she had hired through a third party 6 months ago. The files contained 720 pages of evidence documenting $295 million in embezzlement, shell company transactions, and falsified audit reports. They represented 10 months of her life spent piecing together a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of her own company. They were supposed to be a secret. Natalie pressed her palms flat against the cold marble and tried to push herself up. Her arms trembled with the effort, and she made it halfway before collapsing again. The intruder didn't move to help. He just stood there waiting, and that patience was somehow worse than violence. "I don't know what you're talking about." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, a skill she had learned in 1,000 boardroom negotiations, where showing weakness meant losing everything. "Miss Harlow, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are the Orion files stored? Give me the access codes, and this ends quietly." She turned her head just enough to see the edge of a black coat, polished shoes that probably cost more than most people made in a month. This wasn't some desperate criminal. This was a professional, someone who had been sent by someone who could afford professionals. Eric Drexler. It had to be Eric. He was the only person who knew she had been digging, the only one who would understand that the Orion files represented an existential threat to whatever operation he had been running for the past 3 years. She had trusted him. 13 years of friendship, of building Sentinel security systems, from a 2-person startup into a $3.6 billion empire, and he had been stealing from her the entire time. Natalie didn't answer. She pulled herself forward 6 inches, then another 6, dragging her body across the floor toward the overturned wheelchair 8 feet away. Her phone was clipped to the arm of the chair. If she could just reach it, if she could get her fingers around it, she could trigger the emergency alert that would bring security running. The footsteps behind her moved closer, deliberate and unhurried. This doesn't have to be difficult. She kept moving. Her elbows scraped against the marble, and she could feel the friction burning through the sleeves of her blouse, but she didn't stop. 6 feet, 5 feet. The wheelchair was right there, just out of reach. The knock on the door cut through the tension like a gunshot. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then a voice from the hallway, easy and unhurried. "Building maintenance. Got a work order for suite 4301. Elevator pressure sensor showing an anomaly on this floor. Anyone home?" The man in the black coat went rigid. Natalie could feel the shift in his posture, the sudden recalculation happening behind her. 3 more knocks, louder this time. "Ma'am, sir, this'll only take 5 minutes. Just need to check the utility panel in the corridor." Natalie drew in the deepest breath her compressed lungs could manage and screamed. It wasn't a word, just sound, raw and sharp, and as loud as she could make it, pouring everything she had into it because it might be the only chance she got. The door exploded inward, not opened, exploded. The frame splintered with a crack that echoed through the penthouse, and Natalie heard the collision more than saw it, a heavy impact followed by the skid of shoes on marble. The intruder was running, moving fast through the kitchen toward the service corridor that led to the freight elevator. More footsteps, these ones heavier, following in pursuit. Then silence. Natalie lay on the floor, arms still trembling, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She counted to 10, then 20, forcing herself to breathe in measured intervals. When she finally heard the footsteps returning slower this time, she turned her head toward the shattered doorway. The man who stepped back into the penthouse was somewhere in his early 40s, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested years of manual labor rather than gym memberships. He wore a navy work shirt with a name stitched over the chest pocket in faded thread Callahan. A tool belt hung low on his hips, and his boots were scuffed in a way that spoke to actual use. He wasn't panicking. His eyes moved across the room in a quick, methodical scan, cataloging exits and threats with the efficiency of someone who had been trained to assess spaces under pressure. When his gaze landed on her, his expression shifted not to pity, but to focus. He crossed to her in 4 long strides and crouched down, keeping his hands visible. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you tell me if anything's broken?" Natalie shook her head. "The wheelchair. Can you get it?" He stood without a word, walked to the overturned chair, and examined it with a practiced eye before righting it. He checked the wheel bearings, the frame integrity, the brake mechanism, all in less than 15 seconds. Then he rolled it back to her and positioned it beside her body. "Tell me how you want to do this. You want help, or you want me to just spot you?" The question landed differently than the concern most people offered. There was no assumption in it, no presumption that she needed to be lifted like cargo. It was a practical question from someone who understood that the person on the floor probably knew their own body better than anyone else. "Spot me." He knelt beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough back to give her room to work. Natalie planted her palms on the floor, locked her elbows, and hauled herself up with the upper body strength she had spent 11 years building. Her arms shook with the effort, but she made it to a sitting position, then leveraged herself onto the wheelchair seat with a final push that left her breathless. When she was settled and stable, she gripped both wheels and said nothing for a long moment, just breathing. The man stood and stepped back, giving her space. "You broke down my door." "I heard you scream. The building's going to charge me for it." "Probably." He was looking at her carefully now, not at her legs or the wheelchair, but at her face, reading her the way people read situations when they need to know whether someone is about to collapse or call the police, or both. "You want to tell me what just happened, or you want me to call building security first?" "Both, and I need you to stay." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Okay." Natalie pulled her phone from the wheelchair arm and dialed the building security office. The night supervisor, a man named Briggs who had worked the tower for 6 years, answered on the second ring. She explained the situation in clipped, precise sentences: intruder forced entry, assault suspect fled through service corridor. Briggs promised to review the footage and send a team to the penthouse within 5 minutes. She ended the call and set the phone in her lap. The man who had introduced himself as Callahan was walking a slow circuit of the penthouse, now checking the service door in the kitchen, examining the shattered window, moving through the space with the focused attention of someone who understood how buildings worked from the inside out. He paused at the window, looked down at the street 43 floors below, then turned back to her. "That's a long drop. He didn't go this way. Service corridor leads to the freight elevator," which he probably had access codes for. Callahan pulled a small notebook from his tool belt and flipped it open. "You said you got a work order for this floor." "You did. I heard you say it." "I got a work order for suite 4301 elevator pressure sensor malfunction. Logged in the system 3 hours ago. Except when I pulled up the original ticket before I came up here, there was no record of who submitted it. No name, no department, just an auto-generated request." Natalie went very still. Someone created a fake maintenance call to get access to this floor. "That's what I'm thinking." She looked at him, really looked at him this time, taking in the worn boots and the faded name stitched on his shirt and the small notebook he carried like it mattered. "Who are you?" "Ben Callahan, building systems engineer." I work nights twice a week, mostly checking mechanical failures and running diagnostics on HVAC and elevator systems. He closed the notebook and tucked it back into his belt. I've been working this building for about 8 months. Started noticing things that didn't add up. What kind of things? Things like fake work orders. Things like access logs showing elevator calls to restricted floors at odd hours with no authorized personnel on record. Things like maintenance requests that get filed and then disappear from the system before anyone can follow up. He paused. Things that look like someone's using the building infrastructure to move around without leaving a trail. Security arrived 4 minutes later, a team of 3 led by Briggs, who spent 20 minutes taking statements and reviewing corridor footage that showed exactly nothing. The cameras on the 43rd floor had experienced what Briggs called a temporary malfunction, starting at 11:42 p.m. and ending at 11:51 p.m., a 9-minute window that perfectly bracketed the attack. The intruder was a ghost. No face, no identifying features, just a figure in a black coat who knew exactly where to step to avoid being seen. Briggs promised to pull broader building footage and coordinate with Boston PD. Natalie thanked him and asked him to post someone at the penthouse door for the rest of the night. When the security team finally left, the penthouse was quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles over a space after something has been broken in it. Ben Callahan was still there standing near the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was thoughtful and not entirely satisfied. "What?" Natalie said. "You know who sent him?" It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risk of saying it out loud, the risk of trusting a man she had met 40 minutes ago with information that could get him killed. But he had run toward a scream. He had broken down a door because someone was in trouble. And he had noticed things in this building that no one else had noticed, which meant he was either very observant or very invested in finding out what was wrong. "I know who I think sent him." "Who?" "My CFO, a man named Eric Drexler. We've known each other for 13 years. I brought him into Sentinel when the company was still running out of a co-working space in Cambridge. He was brilliant with numbers, brilliant with people, and I trusted him completely." She paused. "6 months ago, I started finding irregularities in our financial reporting. Small things at first, quarterly projections that didn't quite match the underlying data, subsidiary valuations that seemed inflated. I kept digging, and the more I dug, the worse it got. How bad? $295 million in embezzlement. Shell companies in Delaware and Nevada funneling money through offshore accounts. Falsified audits. A network of complicit board members who signed off on transactions they knew were fraudulent." She met his eyes. "I have proof. 720 pages of documentation that could put Eric Drexler in federal prison for 20 years. That documentation is what the man who broke into my home tonight was looking for." Ben was quiet for a moment, absorbing it. "If you have that kind of proof, why haven't you gone to the FBI? Because Eric has people inside the company who are loyal to him. If I go to the FBI now before I can secure enough votes on the board to authorize an independent audit and freeze the accounts, he'll have time to move the money and destroy the evidence. I have a board meeting scheduled in 9 days. If I can walk into that meeting with enough support to force a vote, I can lock him down before he knows what's happening. And if you can't, then he walks away clean, the fraud becomes the official version of history, and everyone who helped him gets to keep their money." Ben pushed off from the counter and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Boston stretched out in all directions, cold and glittering and utterly indifferent. When he turned back, his expression was serious. "You can't stay here tonight." "I know. Hotel's not safe either. Anywhere you book can be traced through credit cards, reservations, anything tied to your name." "I know that too. I have a house in Dorchester. 3 bedrooms, ground floor entry, no elevator required. My daughter's there, but she sleeps through anything. You'd have your own room, your own space, and nobody outside this building knows my name is connected to yours." Natalie looked at him carefully. "You're asking me to trust you, a man I met less than an hour ago. I'm asking you to be somewhere safe while you figure out what to do next. Everything else is your decision." She thought about Eric Drexler, who she had known for 13 years, who had sat across conference tables from her and smiled and shaken her hand, and embezzled nearly $300 million while she built the company he was stealing from. She thought about the man in the black coat who had stood over her on the floor of her own penthouse, and demanded information she would never give. She thought about Ben Callahan, who had run toward a scream. "I need 20 minutes. I have things I need to take with me. I'll wait." She gathered what she needed in silence: a laptop, an encrypted hard drive, 2 changes of clothes, her medication, and a file folder containing printed copies of the most critical Orion documents. Ben helped her navigate the broken glass and the splintered door frame, then followed her to the private elevator that descended directly to the parking garage. They didn't speak during the ride down. Natalie kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor indicator, watching the numbers descend and trying not to think about the fact that she was leaving her home. Her sanctuary, the one place in the world where she had felt completely in control. The drive to Dorchester took 30 minutes through late-night traffic. Ben's car was a 10-year-old Honda with a child seat in the back and a collection of work manuals stacked on the passenger floor. He drove carefully, checking mirrors more often than necessary, taking side streets instead of the highway. Natalie appreciated the caution, even if it made the drive longer. The house was a narrow 2-story tucked between similar houses on a quiet residential street. Ben pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, then came around to help her transfer from the car to the wheelchair. The ramp leading to the front door was permanent, not temporary, and well-maintained. Someone who lived here used it regularly. "Emma," Ben said quietly as he unlocked the door. "My daughter. She's 9. Lost her mother to cancer 7 years ago. She's used to me working odd hours, but she's not used to house guests. I'll try not to wake her. If she wakes up, she'll have questions. She always has questions." The inside of the house was clean and lived in the kind of space that prioritized function over decoration. A couch, a coffee table, a bookshelf filled with children's books and engineering manuals. Ben led her down a short hallway to a bedroom on the ground floor, small but equipped with everything she would need. He brought her bags in and set them on the bed, then stepped back toward the door. "Bathrooms across the hall. Kitchen's open if you need anything. I'll be upstairs if you need help." "Thank you." He nodded and left, pulling the door closed behind him. Natalie sat in the center of the room and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. A clock ticking somewhere, the hum of a refrigerator, the faint creak of footsteps on the floor above. It was so different from the penthouse, so ordinary and small and safe, that she almost didn't recognize the feeling that moved through her chest. It took her a moment to place it. Relief. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the bedroom with her laptop open and the Orion files spread across her screen, reviewing the evidence she had spent 10 months building. The shell companies, the falsified audits, the email chains between Eric Drexler and 2 board members who had approved transactions they knew were fraudulent. Richard Wolf and Diana Foster. She had their communications, their signatures, their explicit acknowledgement that the subsidiary valuations were inflated and the offshore accounts were being used to hide embezzled funds. What she didn't have yet was proof of the worst part. The part that kept her awake at night, the part that made her stomach turn every time she thought about it. 11 employees over the past 3 years had accessed financial data that could have exposed the fraud. 7 of them had resigned suddenly. 3 had been involved in accidents. 1 had disappeared entirely. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence, too consistent to be bad luck. Someone had been silencing witnesses, and the only person who had the access and the motive to do it was Eric Drexler. A soft sound from the hallway pulled her attention away from the screen. Footsteps light and quick, followed by the creak of a door opening. Natalie closed the laptop and waited. A moment later, there was a knock on her door, tentative and uncertain. "Come in." The girl who pushed the door open was small for 9, with dark hair that stuck up in several directions, and a sweatshirt that said Boston Science Museum across the front. She blinked at Natalie with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she didn't notice things. "Hi, good morning. Are you sleeping over?" "I slept over last night. I'll be leaving soon." Emma considered this with the slow, unhurried analysis that children apply to situations that don't quite make sense. She looked at the wheelchair, then at Natalie, then back at the wheelchair again. "Did something happen to your legs?" Natalie heard footsteps in the hallway. Ben moving quickly toward the room, but she held up a hand before he could intervene. "Yes, a long time ago. They don't work the way they used to." Emma nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. "Do you want some cereal? We have the kind with the marshmallows." Something moved through Natalie's chest. something she wasn't entirely prepared for, something quiet and unguarded that arrived before she could manage it. Sure, I'd like that. Emma disappeared down the hallway, and Ben appeared in the doorway with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry. She wakes up early on Fridays. I should have warned you. It's fine. She doesn't have a filter. I noticed. I don't mind. Ben watched her for a moment, then nodded and followed his daughter toward the kitchen. Natalie rolled after them, navigating the narrow hallway and the slight incline that led to the main living space. Emma was already pulling cereal boxes down from a cabinet with the efficient confidence of a child who had been getting her own breakfast since she was old enough to reach the shelves. Ben poured coffee and set a mug in front of Natalie without asking how she took it. She drank it black, which seemed to satisfy some unspoken assessment he was making. Emma set a bowl of cereal in front of her, with the kind of ceremony that children reserve for gestures they consider generous, then climbed into the chair next to her father. Do you work with Dad? We're working on something together. Is it dangerous? The question landed with the clean, uncomplicated directness of a child who hadn't learned that you're not supposed to ask things like that. Natalie glanced at Ben and found him watching her, waiting to see how she would answer. We're going to make sure it isn't. Emma seemed to accept this. She ate her cereal in silence for a moment, then looked up again. Dad says you're very smart. When did he say that? This morning when I asked who you were. He said you were very smart and very brave, and that I should be polite. Natalie looked at Ben, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Your dad is generous. He's usually right about people. Emma finished her cereal and carried the bowl to the sink, then turned back with the sudden focus of a child who had just remembered something important. I have to go to school. Mrs. Lindstrom is picking me up in 15 minutes. Ben stood and ruffled her hair. Go get your backpack. Emma disappeared down the hallway and the kitchen fell quiet. Ben refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter, looking at Natalie with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the look of someone making a decision that was going to cost them something. I need to tell you something. Something I didn't mention last night because there was too much happening, and I wasn't sure how it connected. But now I think it does. Tell me. The fake work orders I mentioned. The ones that have been showing up in the system for the past 8 months, I started tracking them because a friend of mine pointed me toward them. A colleague who was working a safety inspection contract in the Sentinel building about 14 months ago. He told me he'd found something off about the maintenance logs on floors 38 through 42. He thought it was worth looking into. Natalie's hands went very still around her coffee mug. What happened to your colleague? Ben's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He had an accident at a different job site, fell from a scaffolding platform, broke his leg, cracked 2 vertebrae. He's been on disability since. And you kept looking. I kept looking. She studied him, this man who had spent 8 months quietly documenting irregularities in a building because his friend had been hurt and he wanted to know why. What's your colleague's name? Ben hesitated, and she understood why. Names were dangerous. Names connected people to situations in ways that couldn't be undone. But he had asked her to trust him last night, and trust required reciprocity. Garrett Hale. He'd been doing safety work in the financial district for about 20 years. Solid reputation, careful worker. He doesn't have accidents. The name hit Natalie like a physical blow. She set her coffee down carefully, keeping her hand steady, even though something had just shifted underneath the foundation of the conversation. Garrett Hale worked for Sentinel Security Systems in 2019 and 2020. He was contracted to conduct a full infrastructure review of our primary office building. His contract was terminated in the spring of 2020. The termination was recorded as a performance issue. Ben went very still. Performance issue. That's what the record says. I found it in Eric Drexler's files when I started building the case against him. It was flagged in a way that made me think it was important, but I didn't understand why at the time. I assumed it was a routine personnel matter. It wasn't routine. Ben's voice was quiet and controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. Garrett told me he found a pattern across 3 buildings in the financial district. Maintenance irregularities that looked like they'd been coordinated. He said he thought someone was using building systems to create incidents that looked accidental. When he brought that to the property management company that hired him, they dropped his contract, said he'd missed a filing deadline. He hadn't. Natalie closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. In October of 2019, Garrett Hale submitted a preliminary safety report to Sentinel Security Systems. The report flagged serious concerns about the HVAC ventilation systems on floors 38 through 42. He believed the systems had been deliberately modified to bypass safety protocols. The report came across my desk. What did you do with it? I gave it to Eric Drexler. We were 6 weeks away from breaking ground on a $32 million building renovation. I had a board that was breathing down my neck about the project timeline, and I had an IPO launching in 3 months. I told myself Garrett's concerns were overstated, that he was a cautious contractor covering his liability. I told Eric to handle it. She paused. Eric handled it. He terminated Garrett's contract. He filed a performance note that made it impossible for Garrett to dispute the decision through normal channels. And then the renovation went forward on schedule. Ben said nothing. She watched him process it, watched him work through the implications of what she had just told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was very controlled. The HVAC modifications that Garrett flagged, were they ever addressed? Not during the renovation. I found the original report in Eric's files 6 months ago, along with a note indicating that the systems had been left as is per his instruction. The renovation team was told the safety review had been completed and cleared. She looked at him directly. In April of 2021, there was an electrical fault that triggered an HVAC malfunction on the 41st floor. A small fire. It was contained quickly, but 2 members of the night cleaning staff were hospitalized with smoke inhalation. The incident report attributed the fault to a system overload. It wasn't a system overload. No, it was the panel configuration that Garrett had flagged 18 months earlier. Ben walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to her, both hands braced on the counter. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the controlled quality of his breathing. He was doing what people do when something they thought was one shape reveals itself to be a different shape entirely, and the new shape is larger and darker than they had realized. Garrett told me he thought whoever was behind the building incidents was connected to someone with serious money. Corporate money, someone who could make phone calls that changed outcomes. He turned around. I've been working in that building for 8 months filing reports looking for the thread. I thought I was looking for a corrupt property manager or a negligent building owner. You were looking at the symptom, not the source. His jaw tightened. Garrett almost died. I know. And you're telling me that the man who cost him his contract, the man who may have arranged what happened to him, has been sitting in your company for 13 years? Yes. And you knew he was dangerous when you hired him. The accusation landed exactly where it was aimed. Natalie didn't flinch from it. I thought I could manage him. I thought I could keep him contained, keep him useful, keep him pointed in the right direction. I was wrong. I have spent the last 6 months understanding exactly how wrong I was. Ben looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide something. She could see it happening in real time, the recalibration, the choice to keep helping or to walk away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but no less direct. What do you need from me? I need your safety records, all 8 months, every incident, every anomaly, every report you filed, and every response you got or didn't get. I need you to help me understand what Garrett found, not just the documentation, but the instinct. What he saw that made him think these incidents were coordinated. She paused. Because I'm looking at the financial side of this, and you're looking at the operational side, and I think when we put them together, we're going to see something that neither of us can explain away. Ben picked up his coffee mug, realized it was empty, and set it back down. I'll call Garrett this morning. He's been quiet since the accident. I think he's been scared. But if I tell him what's happening, he'll talk. Don't tell him everything yet. Tell him we're close to the end of it. Tell him his records matter. Don't tell him where we are or how far this goes until we know his phone is clean. You think his phone's being monitored? I think Eric Drexler has been 3 steps ahead of multiple people for 13 years. I'm not going to assume anything is secure until I can verify it. He nodded slowly. Okay. From down the hall came a sound, a door opening, small feet on the floor. Emma reappeared in the kitchen doorway with her backpack over both shoulders and a library book tucked under her arm. She looked at her father, then at Natalie, then back at her father with the evaluating expression of a child trying to figure out if something was wrong. Mrs. Lindstrom's here. Ben crossed to her and knelt down, checking her backpack straps with the automatic efficiency of a parent who had done this 1,000 times. Have a good day at school. I'll pick you up at 3:30. Emma hugged him, then turned to Natalie. Bye, Miss Natalie. Goodbye, Emma. Are you going to be here when I get home? Ben started to answer, but Natalie spoke first. I don't know yet, but I hope so. Emma seemed satisfied with that. She turned and headed for the front door, and a moment later they heard it close behind her. The house settled into a different kind of quiet, the absence of a child leaving a space that felt suddenly larger and emptier. Ben stood and walked back to the counter. She likes you. She doesn't know me. She's good at reading people, better than most adults. He paused. If you're going to be here when she gets home, I need to know what that means. How long you're planning to stay, what the arrangement is, whether this is one night or something longer. Natalie looked at him steadily. I don't know yet. I need to figure out my next move, and I need to do it somewhere Eric Drexler can't find me. Your house is that place, at least for now. If that's a problem, tell me, and I'll find somewhere else. It's not a problem. I just need to know so I can explain it to Emma in a way that makes sense to a 9-year-old. Tell her I'm a friend who needs help. Tell her I'm going to be staying for a little while until some things get sorted out. Tell her the truth in a way she can understand. He nodded. I can do that. They spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen, Ben's laptop and Natalie's laptop side by side on the table, building a timeline. Ben pulled up his safety records, 8 months of incident reports and maintenance logs and access anomalies that he had been documenting with the methodical patience of someone who understood that patterns only emerge when you had enough data. Natalie pulled up the financial records, the shell company transactions, and the falsified audits, and the email chains that connected Eric Drexler to 2 board members who had signed off on fraud. The connections started appearing almost immediately. In March of 2023, a junior financial analyst named Alicia Morgan had accessed a subsidiary valuation report that showed a $40 million discrepancy. 6 days later, the HVAC system on the 41st floor had experienced what the maintenance log called a routine carbon monoxide sensor malfunction. Alicia Morgan had been working late that night. She had been hospitalized with CO poisoning and had resigned from Sentinel 2 weeks later. In August of 2023, an IT administrator named James Carver had logged into the encrypted server where the original financial models were stored. 9 days later, his car had experienced brake failure on I-93. The police report listed it as mechanical failure, but Ben pulled the service records and found that the brakes had been inspected and certified 3 days before the accident. The pattern repeated. Access to sensitive data followed within days by an incident that removed the person from the equation. Not always dramatic, sometimes just a sudden resignation or a transfer to a different office or a medical leave that turned permanent. But when you laid them all in a row, the shape they made was unmistakable. Ben counted them out loud. 11 separate individuals over 3 years who had some proximity to the financial irregularities and then stopped being a factor. Natalie looked at the list. He had made names and dates and the bare facts of what had happened to each person. Third from the bottom, Garrett Hale. Safety inspector contract terminated April 2020, preceded by safety report flagging HVAC modifications. Followed 14 months later by scaffolding accident. Garrett knew, she said quietly. He knew something was wrong, and he tried to report it, and Eric made sure he couldn't. Ben's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread. How many of these people are still in Boston? I don't know. Some of them moved. Alicia Morgan is in Portland. James Carver went to Denver. 2 of the junior analysts just disappeared from the records entirely. We need to find them, or at least the ones who are willing to talk. Most of them are going to be scared. They got out because they were smart enough to recognize danger, and asking them to come back and testify is asking them to put themselves in that danger again. Then we find the one who's angry enough to do it anyway. Natalie looked at him. You have someone in mind. Owen Price. He was compliance director at Sentinel until he resigned in 2022. I saw his name in your files. If he left because he knew something was wrong and couldn't fix it, he might be willing to help us prove it. She pulled up Owen's employment record. He had worked at Sentinel for 9 years, rising through the compliance division until he was appointed director in 2020. His resignation in November of 2022 was listed as voluntary personal reasons, no additional details. But Natalie had found something else in Eric's files. A performance review from October of 2022. The first mediocre review Owen had received in his entire tenure at the company. Documented deficiencies in areas where he had never had a single flag before. Eric had been building a paper trail to discredit him. "I'll have my attorney reach out," Natalie said. "If he's willing to talk, we meet him in person. Somewhere neutral." Ben nodded and closed his laptop. "I need to get to work. I have a shift starting in 2 hours, and if I miss it, someone's going to ask questions I don't want to answer." He stood and carried his mug to the sink. "You'll be okay here." "I'll be fine." Emma gets home at 3:30. Mrs. Lindstrom drops her off. "If you need anything before then, my number's on the fridge." He left through the front door, and Natalie heard his car pull out of the driveway a moment later. The house settled into silence again, and she sat at the kitchen table with 2 laptops and a list of 11 names, and the quiet, steady understanding that she was no longer doing this alone. She thought about Garrett Hale, who had tried to do the right thing and had been punished for it. She thought about Alicia Morgan and James Carver, and all the others who had seen something wrong and had either been silenced or had run before they could be. She thought about Eric Drexler, who had sat across from her in 1,000 meetings and smiled and built a career on other people's pain. And she thought about the board meeting in 8 days, the moment when everything she had built for the past 10 months would either succeed or collapse. She needed 9 votes. She had commitments from 4. That left 5 board members she still needed to reach, 5 conversations she needed to have in spaces Eric couldn't monitor, 5 chances to get this right. Her phone buzzed. A text from her attorney, Owen Price, willing to meet. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. location, TBD. Confirmed." Natalie typed back, "Confirmed." She set the phone down and looked at the list of names on the screen. 11 people whose lives had been disrupted or destroyed because they had gotten too close to the truth. She was about to ask them to help her prove it, which meant she was asking them to risk everything they had rebuilt in the years since they had escaped. But she wasn't asking them to do it alone, and maybe that would make the difference. The coffee shop Owen Price chose was 40 minutes outside Boston, a small place in Framingham that looked like it had been serving the same menu since 1987. Natalie arrived first, rolling through the door at 9:52 a.m. and positioning herself at a corner booth with clear sight lines to both entrances. Ben had offered to come with her, but she had declined. Owen was more likely to talk if he didn't feel outnumbered, and bringing Ben would have raised questions she wasn't ready to answer yet. Owen walked in at exactly 10 o'clock, which told her something about the kind of man he was. Mid-30s, slight build, wearing a jacket that was too heavy for the mild October weather. He had the careful, neutral expression of someone who had spent a decade in compliance learning that showing emotion cost you things. When he spotted her, something moved across his face recognition, followed by something more complicated underneath it. He slid into the booth across from her without preamble. "You look different than I expected." "How so?" "On TV, you always look like you're in complete control. Right now, you look like someone who hasn't slept in 3 days." Natalie appreciated the directness. "I haven't. Not well anyway." A waitress appeared, poured coffee without asking if they wanted it, and disappeared again. Owen wrapped both hands around his mug but didn't drink. "Your attorney said you needed to talk about something sensitive." She didn't specify what. "I'm building a case against Eric Drexler. Financial fraud, embezzlement, obstruction. I have 720 pages of documentation, and I'm presenting it to the board in 8 days. I need someone who can speak to the internal methodology, who can testify about how the fraud was structured and who directed it." Owen stared at her. "You want me to testify against Eric Drexler? I want you to tell the truth about what you saw when you were compliance director, what you were asked to do, what you were pressured not to see, and why you resigned." He set his mug down carefully. "Do you have any idea what you're asking?" "Yes, I'm asking you to put yourself in danger. I'm asking you to risk retaliation from people who have already demonstrated they're willing to hurt anyone who gets in their way. I'm asking you to trust that I can protect you when I haven't been able to protect anyone else." She paused. "But I'm also telling you that if you don't help me, Eric Drexler walks away from this with $300 million and a clean record, and every person he silenced will have been silenced for nothing." Owen looked at his coffee for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I joined Sentinel because I believed in the work. Cybersecurity matters. Protecting data, protecting infrastructure, protecting people from threats they can't see coming. I thought I was part of something important. He paused. In August of 2021, I pulled an internal audit for the subsidiaries. Standard quarterly review. The numbers didn't match. 4 companies showing asset valuations that were inflated by approximately $240 million across a 3-year period. That's not accounting error. That's deliberate strategy. Natalie pulled out a notepad. What did you do when you found it? I flagged it to my supervisor. He told me to hold the report pending additional review. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Eric Drexler. He told me the valuations were part of a long-term capital restructuring strategy that had been approved by the board, and that my concerns reflected a misunderstanding of complex financial instruments. He suggested I take a training course in advanced accounting. Did you? No, I kept digging. Found email chains between Eric and 2 board members, Richard Wolff and Diana Foster, discussing offshore distribution channels and shell company structures. Found intercompany loan documents that moved money between the subsidiaries and 2 entities registered in Delaware with the same legal agent. The registered agent also happened to represent Wolff and Foster, personally, not just the company. Natalie wrote that down. Richard Wolff and Diana Foster. She had suspected they were involved, but this was the first concrete evidence connecting them directly to the shell companies. What happened when you brought that to Eric's attention? I didn't bring it to Eric. I documented it and kept it to myself. Put in a transfer request to the Austin office because I thought if I could get out of Boston, I'd have time to figure out what to do with what I knew. He looked up. The transfer was denied. No explanation. 3 weeks later, my annual performance review came back. First mediocre review I'd had in 9 years. Suddenly, I had documented deficiencies in judgment attention to detailed professional communication. All the things you write down when you want to build a case for termination. Eric was preparing to fire you. He was preparing to make sure that if I ever said anything about what I'd found, no one would believe me. I'd just be a disgruntled employee with performance issues trying to settle a score. Owen's jaw tightened. I resigned in November of 2022. Told my wife I wanted to spend more time with the kids. She knew I was lying, but she didn't push. I've been working as a consultant since then, small firms, nothing high profile. And I've been waking up at 3 in the morning for 2 years, thinking about Alicia Morgan. The name hung between them. Natalie set down her pen. You knew Alicia. We were hired in the same cohort. Not close friends, but we knew each other. We'd get coffee, sometimes talk about work. She was sharp. She cared about doing things right. He paused. When she ended up in the hospital after that CO incident and then just disappeared, I knew it wasn't coincidence. I knew it even then. I just couldn't make myself do anything about it. You were protecting your family. I was protecting myself. My family was the excuse I told myself so I could sleep at night. He looked at her directly. What do you need from me? Natalie slid an envelope across the table. Everything you kept. The audit reports, the emails, the documentation of the shell company structures. And I need you to be willing to speak to the board as a witness, not at the meeting itself, but afterward when the independent audit begins and investigators start asking questions. Owen opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. His hands were steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he scanned the documents. This is a witness affidavit. Prepared by my attorney, it outlines what you would be testifying to and provides legal protection for you as a whistleblower. If you sign it, you're protected under federal law from retaliation. Legal protection doesn't stop accidents. No, but it makes accidents a lot harder to arrange without federal investigators getting involved. He folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. I need to think about it. I need to talk to my wife. I understand. I need an answer by Monday. The board meeting is Thursday. Owen stood and pulled on his jacket. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why now? You've been running Sentinel for 15 years. Eric's been there almost as long. What made you finally start looking? Natalie met his eyes. I got tired of being the person who didn't ask questions. I got tired of trusting systems I should have been auditing. And I got tired of watching good people leave the company for reasons that never quite made sense. She paused. I should have started looking years ago. I didn't. That's on me. Owen nodded slowly. I'll call you Monday. He left. Natalie sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, finishing her coffee and reviewing her notes. $240 million in inflated valuations, email chains connecting Eric to Richard Wolff and Diana Foster. A registered legal agent who represented both the shell companies and the corrupt board members personally. It was exactly the kind of evidence she needed to prove that the fraud went beyond Eric, that it was a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple layers of the company's leadership. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ben. Found something. Can you come back to the house? She paid the check and drove back to Dorchester, navigating through midday traffic with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take shortcuts. When she pulled into Ben's driveway, he was waiting on the front porch with his laptop under one arm. What did you find? He held the door open for her. Access logs from the Sentinel building. I pulled the records for floors 38 through 42 going back 3 years. Cross-referenced them with the dates when each of the 11 victims accessed sensitive financial data. They sat at the kitchen table and Ben opened the laptop. On the screen was a spreadsheet with 3 columns, names, dates, and access times. Next to each name was a second set of dates and times showing elevator calls and keycard entries to restricted areas. Look at the pattern. Alicia Morgan accesses the subsidiary valuation report on March 14, 2023 at 8:47 p.m. 6 days later, on March 20th, there's a maintenance access log for the HVAC system on floor 41 at 11:32 p.m. The access code used belongs to a contractor named Miguel Santos. Natalie leaned closer. Who is Miguel Santos? Maintenance worker for the building, been on staff for 4 years. I pulled his employment records. He's authorized for basic repairs, cleaning, filter changes. He's not authorized for system modifications or electrical work. Ben scrolled down. But he's been accessing restricted mechanical areas at least once a month for the past 2 years, always at night, always using authorization codes that shouldn't give him that level of access. Someone gave him override credentials. That's what I think. And I think that someone is Eric Drexler because the pattern of Miguel's access correlates almost perfectly with the timeline of incidents. Ben pulled up another tab. James Carver accesses the financial server on August 3rd, 2023. 8 days later, Miguel enters the parking garage mechanical room at 2:14 a.m. Carver's brake failure happens the next morning. Natalie's stomach turned. You think Miguel tampered with the brakes? I think someone did. Whether it was Miguel himself or whether he was just opening doors for someone else, I can't say. But the access pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. We need to talk to him. I tried. Went to the building this morning before my shift ended. Miguel called in sick yesterday and hasn't been back since. His supervisor said he's never missed a day in 4 years. The implications settled between them like a weight. If Miguel had been spooked, if he had gone to ground or been told to disappear, it meant someone knew they were getting close. It meant the investigation was no longer quiet. Natalie's phone rang. Her attorney. She answered on the second ring. What is it? The voice on the other end was controlled but urgent. We have a problem. Someone filed a motion this morning to freeze your access to Sentinel's internal systems. The motion cites concerns about potential data theft and unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information. It's being heard by a judge tomorrow afternoon. Who filed it? Eric Drexler's personal attorney. Natalie closed her eyes. Eric knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough to start moving defensively. Freezing her system access would cut her off from any additional evidence she might need, and it would send a message to the board that she was under investigation, that her credibility was in question. Can you fight it? I can try, but if the judge grants a temporary injunction, you'll be locked out by Monday morning. That gives you 72 hours to pull anything you still need from the servers. I already have everything I need. The Orion files are complete. Then we wait for the hearing and hope the judge sees this for what it is, a defensive move by someone who knows he's about to be exposed. Natalie ended the call and set the phone on the table. Ben was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had just heard half a conversation and was filling in the gaps. They're coming after you. Eric is. He's trying to discredit me before I can present the evidence. If he can make it look like I'm the one acting improperly, if he can raise enough doubt about my motives, it gives him cover to dismiss everything I found as the paranoid accusations of a CEO who's lost perspective. What do you do? I keep moving forward. I reach the board members I need to reach. I get Owen Price to commit. And I make sure that when I walk into that meeting on Thursday, I have enough votes locked down that Eric can't stop it. She looked at him. How many of the board members live in the greater Boston area? Checking now. Ben pulled up a separate file. 11 out of 14. The other 3 are in New York, San Francisco, and London. I can't reach the one in London. Too complicated. But the New York and San Francisco members can be contacted by secure video if I need to. That leaves 11 I can approach in person. She pulled out her notepad. I already have commitments from Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Granger. That's 2. Robert Kincaid and Linda Hartley are maybes. Richard Wolfe and Diana Foster are compromised. That leaves 5 unknowns I need to convert. Ben closed his laptop. You're going to try to do all of that in 6 days while Eric is actively working against you. Yes. That's a lot of risk. It's the only option I have left. He stood and walked to the refrigerator, pulling out 2 bottles of water and setting one in front of her. I have something that might help. Richard Wolfe keeps a private office in the Prudential Tower. It's not his Sentinel board office, it's for his personal investment firm. The building has a fire safety inspection scheduled for next week. I know the contractor who's handling it. I can get access. Natalie looked at him carefully. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to inspect the building. Legitimate work, legitimate reason to be there. And if I happen to run into Richard Wolfe while I'm checking the sprinkler systems on his floor, I might mention that I've noticed some unusual access patterns in the building security logs. Things that suggest someone's been entering secured areas without proper authorization. You're going to make him think he's being investigated. I'm going to make him think someone's watching him. Someone who isn't you, someone who has no connection to Sentinel. Someone who's approaching this from a completely different angle. Ben paused. Scared people make mistakes. If Richard thinks he's been compromised, he might start distancing himself from Eric. And if he distances himself, he might be more willing to cooperate when the audit starts. It was risky. If Richard went directly to Eric and told him about the encounter, it could accelerate Eric's defensive timeline and force him to move faster than they were prepared for. But if it worked, if Richard could be isolated and turned, it would break the coalition that had protected Eric for the past 3 years. When is the inspection? Monday morning. I'll have access to the building from 8 to noon. Do it, but be careful. If Richard suspects you're working with me, this falls apart. He won't. I'm just a building inspector doing my job. The afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls and encrypted emails. Natalie reached out to 3 more board members using contact information Ben had helped her compile through public records and professional networking sites. One agreed to meet, one asked for more information before committing, and one didn't respond at all. By 6 o'clock, she had set up 2 meetings for the following day, both at neutral locations where they could talk without being overheard. Emma came home at 3:30, dropped off by a neighbor with 2 other kids in tow. She burst through the front door with the kinetic energy of a 9-year-old who had been sitting in a classroom all day and needed to move. When she saw Natalie at the kitchen table, she stopped short. You're still here. I'm still here. Are you staying again tonight? Ben appeared in the doorway. Miss Natalie is going to be staying with us for a little while. Is that okay with you? Emma considered this with the serious expression she applied to important questions. Does she have her own room? She does. Then it's okay. Emma dropped her backpack on the floor and climbed into the chair across from Natalie. What are you doing? You're working. On what? Something important. Emma leaned forward, studying Natalie with unguarded curiosity. Dad says you're very brave. Are you scared? The question landed with the weight of all the things Natalie hadn't let herself feel for the past 3 days. Fear had been there, constant and present, but she had kept it compartmentalized, locked away in the part of her mind where she stored things she couldn't afford to deal with yet. Hearing it spoken out loud by a 9-year-old stripped away the compartments and left her facing it directly. Yes, I'm scared. But you're doing it anyway. Yes. Emma nodded, apparently satisfied. Dad says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing even when you're scared. Your dad is right. He usually is. Emma pulled a book out of her backpack. I have to read 20 pages for homework. Do you want to read with me? Natalie glanced at Ben, who was watching from the doorway, with an expression she couldn't quite read. He gave a small nod and she turned back to Emma. I'd like that. They sat at the kitchen table for the next 40 minutes, Emma reading aloud from a book about a girl who discovered a secret door in her grandmother's attic. Natalie listening and occasionally asking questions, when Emma paused to explain a particularly interesting detail. It was the most ordinary thing Natalie had done in weeks, sitting in a stranger's kitchen, listening to a child read about fictional adventures, and the ordinariness of it felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. When Emma finished her homework, Ben made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and vegetables and garlic bread, but he cooked with the efficient competence of someone who had been feeding a family for years. They ate together at the table, Emma talking about her day at school, and a science project she was working on, and a friend who had brought a hamster to show and tell. Natalie answered when Emma asked her questions, but mostly she just listened, absorbing the rhythm of a household that functioned in ways hers never had. After dinner, Emma disappeared to her room to work on the science project, and Ben and Natalie were left alone in the kitchen with the dishes. He washed, she dried, and they worked in a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. "Thank you for this," Natalie set a plate on the drying rack. "For letting me stay, for helping with the investigation, for not treating this like an imposition." Ben rinsed a glass and handed it to her. "You needed help. I was in a position to give it. That's not complicated. It is for most people. Durna. Most people haven't spent 8 months documenting building safety violations because they thought their friend's accident wasn't really an accident." He paused. "I know what it's like to see something wrong and not be able to fix it. And I know what it's like to carry that around for months wondering if you should have done more." Natalie dried the glass and set it carefully in the cabinet. "Your friend Garrett, have you talked to him since yesterday?" "This morning. Told him we were close to understanding what happened, that his safety reports mattered, and that we needed him to stay quiet for a few more days." "How did he react?" "He asked if I was sure about this. Asked if I knew what I was getting into. I told him I did." Ben drained the sink and dried his hands. "He said he'd been waiting 2 years for someone to ask him the right questions. Said he had copies of everything. Original reports, photographs of the HVAC modifications, correspondence with the property management company that terminated his contract. He kept it all." "Can we meet with him?" "Not yet. He's scared, and he has reason to be. If we bring him into this, before we're ready, before we have protection in place, we're putting him at risk again." Ben folded the towel and set it on the counter. "But after the board meeting, after the audit is authorized and federal investigators get involved, he'll talk. He wants to. He just needs to know it's safe." Natalie understood that. She had asked 11 people to risk their safety by helping her expose Eric Drexler, and most of them had said no because the risk was too high and the protection was too uncertain. She couldn't blame them. She could only hope that the ones who said yes would be enough. That night, she sat in the small bedroom with her laptop open and reviewed the materials she would need for the board presentation. 720 pages of documentation organized into 3 sections: financial evidence, operational evidence, and witness testimony. The financial evidence showed the embezzlement, the shell companies, the falsified audits. The operational evidence showed the pattern of incidents, the coordinated silencing of anyone who got too close to the truth. The witness testimony provided the human context, the voices of people who had seen what Eric Drexler was willing to do to protect himself. It was comprehensive, it was damning. And if she could get 9 votes, it would be enough to trigger an independent audit that Eric couldn't control or suppress. Her phone buzzed. A text from her attorney judge ruled. "Motion denied. Your access remains intact." Natalie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eric's attempt to cut her off had failed, which meant he was running out of defensive options. He would try something else, something more aggressive, but for now she had won a small victory. She closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the next 6 days. 2 meetings tomorrow with board members who might or might not commit. A meeting with Owen Price on Monday to get his final answer. Ben's confrontation with Richard Wolff, which could either isolate the corrupt board members or push them into a defensive alliance with Eric. And then Thursday, the board meeting, the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart. She thought about what Emma had said. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing even when you're scared. Natalie was scared. She had been scared for months, carrying the weight of what she knew and what she was planning to do with it. But the fear hadn't stopped her, and it wouldn't stop her now. The weekend passed in a series of carefully orchestrated meetings. Saturday morning, Natalie met with board member Thomas Granger at a public library in Newton. Granger was 66, a retired defense contractor who had joined the Sentinel board 5 years ago and had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions during quarterly reviews. He listened to Natalie's presentation for 40 minutes without interrupting, then asked for copies of the shell company documentation. He committed his vote before she left. Saturday afternoon, she met with Linda Hartley at a botanical garden in Jamaica Plain. Linda was 54, a former federal prosecutor who now ran a legal consulting firm. She was harder to convince. She wanted to know how Natalie had obtained the evidence, whether any of it could be challenged as improperly sourced, and what protections were in place for whistleblowers who came forward. Natalie answered every question with the precision of someone who had anticipated them weeks ago. Linda asked for 24 hours to review the materials before committing. Sunday morning, Robert Kincaid called. He had received the encrypted documents Natalie had sent and wanted to meet in person. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Cambridge at noon. Robert was 61, a venture capitalist who had been on the Sentinel board since the company's IPO. He was known for being cautious, for preferring consensus over confrontation, for avoiding votes that would create institutional disruption. Ben had been right about him. Robert didn't need to be convinced that the fraud was real. He needed to be convinced that exposing it was survivable. Natalie met him at the coffee shop and laid out the case with the same methodical precision she had used with the others. When she finished, Robert sat back and looked at her with an expression that was thoughtful and troubled. If you do this, if you walk into that board meeting and present this evidence, the stock is going to tank. We'll lose 30% of our market value in the first week, maybe more. Investors are going to panic. Customers are going to start asking whether their data is safe with a company whose CFO was embezzling hundreds of millions. The stock will recover. It always does when companies demonstrate transparency and accountability. Investors trust companies that clean house, not companies that hide corruption. That's optimistic. It's history. Look at what happened when Wells Fargo exposed their fake account scandal. Stock dropped 24% in the first month, then recovered to pre-scandal levels within 18 months because they took accountability seriously. Natalie paused. The alternative is that Eric Drexler continues to embezzle money, continues to silence witnesses, and eventually gets caught by federal regulators who will prosecute not just him, but everyone who knew and did nothing. That's not survivable. Robert was quiet for a long moment. You're asking me to vote for something that will cost me personally. I have stock options that are worth $8 million. If the stock tanks, that value disappears. I'm asking you to vote for something that's right. Whether it costs you personally is a consequence you'll have to accept. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between respect and resignation. You're not going to make this easy, are you? No. All right. You have my vote. But if this goes sideways, if the company implodes because of this, I'm holding you responsible. I'll accept that. She left the meeting with 6 confirmed votes, 3 more to reach the threshold she needed, and 48 hours before the board meeting. Monday morning, Ben went to the Prudential Tower for the fire safety inspection. He texted Natalie at 10:15 a.m., made contact. Conversation went as expected. We'll brief you later. She didn't hear from him again until early afternoon. When he walked through the front door of the house, his expression was controlled, but she could see the tension underneath it. What happened? Ben set his tool bag on the floor and sat down at the kitchen table. I found Richard Wolf in his office, introduced myself as the fire safety inspector, mentioned I was doing a routine check of the sprinkler, systems, and emergency exits. He was polite, professional, didn't seem concerned. Then I mentioned that I'd noticed some irregularities in the building security logs during my preliminary review. Access entries to secured areas that didn't match the authorized personnel list. How did he react? He went pale, not angry pale, like someone who just heard confirmation of something they'd been afraid of. He asked me how serious it was. I told him that in my professional experience, when security logs show unexplained entries, it usually means either someone inside the building is running unauthorized operations or someone from outside has compromised the access system. Either way, the people with legitimate interests in those spaces needed to be aware. Natalie leaned forward. What did he say? He asked if I'd filed a formal report. I said I was in preliminary assessment and hadn't determined yet whether it rose to the level of formal documentation, that I'd know more in about a week. Ben paused. He shook my hand 3 times, gave me his personal cell number, Asked me to contact him directly if I found anything else. He's scared. Scared enough to turn on Eric. Scared enough to start thinking about exit strategies. Whether that means cooperating with an audit or just trying to distance himself before everything collapses, I can't say. But he's not acting like someone who feels secure in his position. Natalie pulled out her phone and checked her schedule. The board meeting is Thursday at 9 a.m. If Richard is already questioning his alliance with Eric, that gives us leverage. If we can isolate him and Diana Foster, if we can make them understand that their best option is cooperation rather than resistance, we might be able to flip them or at least neutralize them. You think they'd cooperate? I think they do whatever protects them personally. Right now, they're protected by Eric because he controls the narrative and the evidence. But once the audit starts, once federal investigators get involved, their protection disappears. If they understand that they might decide that cooperating is less risky than fighting, her phone rang. Owen Price. She answered immediately. Owen. His voice was steady, but she could hear the weight behind it. I talked to my wife, told her everything. She said if I didn't do this, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. She's right. You'll testify. I'll testify. Not at the board meeting, but afterward when the audit begins. I'll provide everything I have, and I'll answer whatever questions the investigators ask. He paused. But I need you to promise me something. What? That you're not doing this for revenge. That you're doing this because it's right. Because if you're just settling a score with Eric Drexler, people are going to get hurt for the wrong reasons. Natalie closed her eyes for a moment. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because 13 years ago, I brought Eric into my company, and I gave him access and authority and trust, and he used all of it to build a criminal enterprise. I'm doing this because 11 people were harmed trying to expose what he was doing, and they deserve to know that their suffering mattered. And I'm doing this because if I don't, he wins, and winning means he gets to keep doing this to other people and other companies for the rest of his career. Owen was quiet for a long moment. Okay, send me the witness affidavit. I'll sign it. She ended the call and set the phone on the table. Ben was watching her with the steady attention of someone who had just witnessed something important. You have your witness. I have my witness. How many votes do you have? 6 confirmed, 3 maybes. That's not enough. What's your next move? Natalie pulled up her contact list and scrolled through the remaining board members. I reach out to the 3 maybes and push for commitments. And I prepare for the possibility that I'm going to walk into that meeting with less support than I need and have to win votes in the room. That's risky. Everything about this is risky. The question is whether the risk is worth taking. Ben stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. Emma asked me this morning if you were going to be okay. She said you looked tired. I am tired. She's worried about you. She doesn't know what you're doing, but she knows it's important, and she knows you're scared. He turned back. She wanted me to tell you that it's okay to be scared, that scared people can still be brave. Natalie felt something shift in her chest. Your daughter is smarter than most of the board members I've dealt with. She has good instincts. He paused. She also asked if you were going to stay after all of this is over. I told her I didn't know, but I told her I hoped you would. The words hung between them, simple and direct, and carrying weight that neither of them had quite acknowledged yet. Natalie looked at him, this man who had opened his home to a stranger, who had risked his career and his safety to help expose corruption. He had no obligation to fight, who had a 9-year-old daughter asking questions about whether the woman at the kitchen table was going to stay. I don't know what happens after Thursday. I don't know if I'll still have a company to run, or if I'll be spending the next year testifying in federal court, or if Eric Drexler is going to find some way to turn this around and make me the villain. She paused. But I know I don't want to go back to living the way I was living before. Alone in a penthouse, working 18-hour days, trusting no one, and letting no one close enough to matter. Ben crossed back to the table and sat down across from her. Then don't. It's not that simple. It is that simple. You decide what kind of life you want, and you build it. Everything else is just details. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that she could walk out of Thursday's board meeting and into something different, something that looked like the life she had been living in Ben's house for the past 4 days. But belief required hope, and hope required letting go of the control she had spent 11 years rebuilding after the accident took it away. Ask me again after Thursday. I will. That night, Natalie reviewed the board presentation one more time, checking every citation, every document reference, every piece of evidence she would need to support her case. She worked until 2 in the morning, then closed the laptop and lay in the dark thinking about what came next. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to secure the remaining votes to finalize the presentation to prepare for every possible counterargument Eric might raise. 3 days to decide whether she was ready to stand in front of 14 people and accuse her CFO of crimes that could send him to prison for decades. She thought about the 11 victims, the people whose lives had been disrupted or destroyed because they had seen something wrong and tried to do something about it. She thought about Garrett Hale lying in a hospital bed with a broken back because he had flagged safety violations that Eric wanted suppressed. She thought about Alicia Morgan waking up in an emergency room with carbon monoxide poisoning because she had access to financial reports she wasn't supposed to see. She thought about the drunk driver who had hit her car 11 years ago, the impact that had stolen her legs and rewritten her entire existence. And she wondered if that too had been something other than random chance. The thought had been lurking at the edges of her mind for weeks, refusing to fully form, but refusing to disappear. What if the accident hadn't been an accident? What if someone had wanted her gone, had wanted the company destabilized, had paid a desperate person to make it happen? She pushed the thought away. It was too large, too dark, and she didn't have the evidence to support it. But the question remained sitting in the back of her mind like a weight she couldn't put down. 3 days. And then she would know whether all of this had been worth it. The rain started before dawn on Tuesday, drumming against the windows of Ben's house with the kind of relentless intensity that made Boston feel like it was trying to wash itself clean. Natalie woke at 5:30 after 3 hours of sleep that felt more like drowning than rest. She had dreamed about the accident, not the usual fractured images of headlights and broken glass, but something more specific. A man in a car watching her pull onto I-90, a phone call being made, a transaction completing before the drunk driver even started his engine. She transferred to her wheelchair and rolled into the kitchen. Ben was already there, laptop open, his face lit by the blue glow of the screen. He looked up when he heard her wheels. Wall Street Journal just published, "You need to see this." The headline read, "Sentinel Security Systems Under Federal Investigation for Potential Securities Fraud." Twankun. The article cited anonymous sources, mentioned irregularities in subsidiary valuations, and suggested that the SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry. It was careful, legally vetted, and completely calculated to arrive exactly 48 hours before Natalie's board presentation. Eric leaked this. She scrolled through the article, her mind already racing through the implications. He's controlling the narrative. If the story breaks now, it looks like I'm reacting to federal pressure instead of driving internal accountability. He's trying to make me look like I'm jumping on a bandwagon. Ben poured coffee and set it in front of her. "Can you prove he leaked it?" "I don't need to prove it. I need to get ahead of it." She pulled out her phone and called her attorney. 3 rings before the voicemail picked up. She tried again. On the 3rd attempt, her attorney called back. "I was about to call you. The Journal piece just went live. I've already had reporters asking if you knew about the SEC investigation, if you've been cooperating with federal authorities, if you have any comment about potential criminal charges." Natalie's hands tightened on the phone. "What did you tell them?" Standard corporate response. "Sentinel is committed to transparency and cooperation, but we need to issue our own statement before market close today. I'm drafting something that positions you as the person who discovered the fraud months ago, not someone reacting to external pressure. Do it. Make sure it's out by 3 p.m. She ended the call. Ben was watching her with the careful assessment of someone trying to determine how close another person was to breaking. "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway." He made eggs and toast, setting the plate in front of her with quiet insistence. She forced herself through the meal mechanically, knowing he was right, even if her body was rejecting the idea of food. Somewhere between the second bite and the third, her phone rang again. Robert Kincaid. "Natalie, I'm getting calls from board members who want to postpone Thursday's meeting. The Journal article has people spooked. They want to wait for the SEC investigation to conclude before we take any internal action." "Who's calling for the postponement?" Silence answered her question. She knew without him saying it. Richard Wolff and Diana Foster were working the phones, leveraging the Journal article to buy Eric time. Robert, if we postpone, Eric disappears the money. Every day we delay is another day he has to move assets offshore and destroy documentation. The SEC moves slowly. Eric moves fast. I know that, but I'm telling you there's resistance. Real resistance. People are scared of making the wrong move. Then you need to convince them that waiting is the wrong move. You're a venture capitalist. You've built a career on evaluating risk. Tell them the risk of acting is smaller than the risk of doing nothing. I'll do what I can. The call ended. 7 confirmed votes. 2 short of what she needed, and now Eric's allies were actively working to prevent the meeting from happening at all. Ben stood and pulled on his jacket. I need to run an errand. I'll be back in 2 hours. Where are you going? To find Miguel Santos. Natalie went very still. The maintenance worker who disappeared. How do you know where he is? Friend of mine in building security saw him at a motel in Revere yesterday. I'm going to see if he'll talk. Ben, if Miguel tampered with those building systems, if he's the one who cut James Carver's brakes, this could be dangerous. I'm not going to threaten him. I'm going to offer him a way out. He's scared and hiding, which means he knows what he did was wrong. If I can convince him that cooperating is safer than running, we might get testimony that connects Eric directly to the incidents. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him the risk was too high. But she had spent months taking risks other people thought were reckless, and she had no standing to tell him to play it safe. Be careful. Always am. He left. The house fell quiet except for the rain and the distant hum of morning traffic. Natalie returned to her laptop and spent the next hour refining her board presentation, but her mind kept circling back to something else. The accident, 2014. The drunk driver who had hit her car and disappeared into the criminal justice system while she spent 6 months learning how to live without her legs. She pulled up a search window and typed Jason Mills, Massachusetts, DUI 2014. The results were sparse. A brief mention in a local news article about the accident. A court record showing he had pleaded guilty to vehicular assault and received a suspended sentence with mandatory rehab. And then nothing. No current address, no social media presence, no trace of a man who had fundamentally altered her life and then evaporated. She refined the search Jason Mills defense attorney, 2014. That's when she found it. The law firm that had represented Mills pro bono was Whitmore and Cross. She recognized the name immediately. The same firm that represented Silas Reed's hedge fund. Her hand stopped moving on the keyboard. She sat very still, reading the same line 3 times to make sure she wasn't making connections that didn't exist. But the connection was there, documented and undeniable. Silas Reed's law firm had defended the drunk driver who had hit her, and they had done it for free. She pulled up Reed's financial history. In April of 2014, 3 months before her accident, Reed's fund had taken a massive short position on Sentinel stock. 6 million shares. If the IPO had failed in the wake of losing the company's 30-year-old CEO, if the stock had collapsed in the chaos that followed, Reed would have profited $400 million. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. She reached for her phone and called Ben, but the call went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She wanted to tell him what she had found, wanted someone else to look at this and tell her whether she was seeing a real pattern or manufacturing one out of grief and sleep deprivation. The front door burst open. Emma came in trailing water and backpack, her hair plastered to her head. She kicked off her shoes and stopped when she saw Natalie at the table. Miss Natalie, are you okay? You look really pale. Natalie closed the laptop. Just working. How was school? Boring. We had a substitute in math and she didn't know anything. Emma came closer, tilting her head with the concerned expression of a child who had learned to read adult faces better than most adults could. Dad says you're doing something important on Thursday. Something that's making you scared. Your dad is right. Emma pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the serious posture of someone preparing to say something that mattered. I've been thinking about what brave means. I used to think it meant you weren't scared of anything. But that's not right, is it? No. Being brave means doing what's right even when you're terrified. That's what I thought. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made you something for Thursday, for when you're scared. She slid the paper across the table. Natalie unfolded it carefully. It was a crayon drawing the kind 9-year-olds make with more feeling than technical skill. Three stick figures stood in front of a house. One was labeled D-Ad in careful block letters. One was labeled Emma. The third was labeled Miss Natalie. Above them in Emma's uneven handwriting, "Brave people help each other." Natalie's throat closed. She looked at the drawing, at the simple, uncomplicated declaration of belonging that a child had made because she believed it was true, and something inside her that had been held tight for weeks finally loosened. "Emma, thank you. You can keep it. Put it in your folder or something, for when you need to remember." The door opened again. Ben came in shaking water from his jacket, his expression carefully controlled in a way that told her immediately that the conversation with Miguel had gone somewhere significant. Emma jumped up and ran to hug him, then disappeared down the hall to change out of her wet clothes. Ben sat down at the table and pulled out his phone. Miguel talked. "I recorded everything with his permission." He pressed play. Miguel's voice came through the speaker, nervous and halting, but clear, describing 3 years of being paid by Eric Drexler to access restricted areas, modify building systems, disable security cameras. The admission about the CO sensor that had poisoned Alicia Morgan. The confession about providing access to the parking garage the night before James Carver's brake failure. When the recording ended, Natalie sat back in her chair. "This is direct evidence. This proves Eric actively harmed people." Miguel kept records, bank statements, text messages, photographs of the modifications he made. He's willing to turn everything over to federal investigators once the audit is authorized. "Did you tell him about Thursday?" "I told him the board meeting was happening in 2 days and that he needed to stay out of sight until it was over. He understands." Ben paused. "There's something else." Miguel said Eric never told him why he needed the surveillance or the system modifications. But about 6 months ago, Eric started asking different questions. Started asking if Miguel knew anyone who could do more serious work. Vehicle tampering, access to residential buildings outside the Sentinel property. Natalie's stomach turned. "Eric was looking for someone who could get to me at home." "That's what I think." And when Miguel said he wasn't comfortable with that kind of work, Eric stopped asking. 3 weeks later, you got attacked in your penthouse by someone who knew exactly when to show up and which cameras to avoid. The pieces were assembling into a picture she had been trying not to see. Eric hadn't just been covering up fraud. He had been actively eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him. And when Miguel had refused to help with residential access, Eric had found someone else. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered cautiously. Eric's voice came through calm and conversational. "Natalie, I saw the journal piece this morning. We should talk about this face to face. Work out something that doesn't involve destroying everything we've built together." Every muscle in her body went rigid. She forced her breathing to stay even, her voice to stay steady. "There's nothing to work out. You embezzled $300 million and silenced anyone who discovered it. I understand you're under pressure. Running Sentinel, managing the board, dealing with your personal challenges. Sometimes when we're under that kind of stress, we start seeing patterns that aren't really there. Making connections that feel significant, but don't hold up to scrutiny." The condescension in his voice made her hands shake. He was trying to gaslight her, trying to make her question her own investigation. "I have 720 pages of evidence. Shell companies, falsified audits, witness testimony, access logs. I have Owen Price ready to testify about the compliance violations you pressured him to ignore. I have Miguel Santos's confession about the building systems you paid him to tamper with. This isn't stress. This is documentation." Silence on Eric's end. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone. "You need to understand something. If you walk into that board meeting Thursday and present your evidence, you're not just coming after me. You're inviting federal investigators to examine everyone who should have known. That includes the CEO, who signed off on subsidiary valuations without reading the underlying reports. The CEO who approved safety reviews without following up on flagged concerns. The SEC doesn't just prosecute the CFO, Natalie. They prosecute everyone who was willfully blind." The threat landed exactly where he aimed it. But she had spent 11 years learning how to absorb impacts and keep moving forward. "You're going to argue I should have caught you sooner? That I'm complicit through negligence? And you know what, you're right. I should have been paying attention. I should have read Garrett Hale's safety report instead of delegating it. I should have questioned the subsidiary valuations instead of trusting your numbers. But the difference between negligence and fraud is intent. I was negligent. You were criminal, and I'm willing to face the consequences of my failures if it means you face the consequences of your crimes. Eric's voice went very quiet. You're making a mistake. No, I'm correcting one. She ended the call and set the phone on the table. Her hands were shaking badly now, adrenaline flooding through her system in a way she couldn't control. Ben was watching her with an expression that was part concern and part something else. He threatened to drag you down with him. He did, and he will if he gets the chance. Which is why I need to make sure the evidence is so overwhelming that my mistakes look like exactly what they were. Oversight failures, not criminal conspiracy. You think the SEC will see it that way? I think if I cooperate fully and accept responsibility for not catching this sooner, I have a chance. If I try to claim I knew nothing and saw nothing, they'll bury me alongside Eric. She pulled the laptop closer. I need those last 2 votes. Who else can we reach today? Ben checked his contacts. Patricia Monroe is in San Francisco, but she's scheduled to fly back to Boston tonight for a conference tomorrow. You could catch her at the airport or the hotel. Set it up. I'll meet her anywhere she's willing to talk. And James Whitfield lives in Cambridge, works from home on Tuesdays. Call him. Tell him I'll come to him if he'll give me 30 minutes. Ben made the calls. Patricia agreed to meet at her hotel at 8 p.m. James agreed to a video call at 4. Natalie spent the afternoon preparing for both conversations, refining her pitch, anticipating objections, building the case for why postponing the board meeting was the same as letting Eric win. The video call with James lasted 45 minutes. He asked hard questions about the evidence, about her role in missing the fraud, about what would happen to Sentinel's stock price when the scandal became public. She answered every question with the brutal honesty of someone who had nothing left to hide. When the call ended, James said he would review the documentation overnight and give her an answer by morning. The meeting with Patricia was different. Patricia was a former federal prosecutor who had built a career on reading people and evaluating evidence. She listened to Natalie's presentation for 30 minutes without interrupting, then asked a single question. Why should I believe you're doing this for the right reasons and not because Eric threatened your position? Natalie met her eyes. Because if I wanted to protect my position, I would have buried this investigation the moment I found the first piece of evidence. It would have been easier, safer, less likely to destroy my company and my reputation. But I kept digging because 11 people were harmed trying to expose what Eric was doing, and they deserved to know their suffering mattered. Patricia nodded slowly. Send me the complete file. If it's as strong as you say, you have my vote. Natalie returned to Ben's house at 10 p.m., exhausted and wired in equal measure. Emma was already asleep. Ben was at the kitchen table with tea and a book, but he closed it when he heard her wheels. How did it go? Patricia will vote yes if the evidence holds up. James is reviewing overnight. She rolled to the table and accepted the tea he poured for her. That gives me 8 confirmed votes if James commits. I'm still 1 short of what I need. You'll get there. You sound very certain. I've watched you work for the past week. You don't give up. You'll find the 9th vote. She wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her palms. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain still falling outside, softer now but persistent. She thought about Eric's threat about the SEC investigation that would examine everyone, including her, about the possibility that she might lose everything she had built in the process of trying to save it. Can I ask you something? Ben's voice was quiet, careful. Go ahead. The accident that put you in the wheelchair. You've mentioned it a few times, but you've never talked about what you think really happened. Do you believe it was random? Natalie set down the mug. She had been carrying this question for weeks, letting it grow heavier with each new piece of evidence, each new connection she uncovered. And now sitting in Ben's kitchen at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, with 36 hours until the board meeting, she didn't have the energy to carry it alone anymore. I found something today. The law firm that represented the drunk driver who hit me. They did it pro bono, which seemed strange at the time because pro bono legal defense for DUI cases isn't common. Today I found out that same law firm represents Silas Reed's hedge fund. Ben went very still. The hedge fund manager who's been shorting Sentinel stock. In April of 2014, Reed's fund took a short position on 6 million Sentinel shares. 3 months later, a drunk driver hit my car on I-90. If I had died, if the company had collapsed, Reed would have profited $400 million. She looked at him directly. I think Reed paid someone to kill me. I think the driver was supposed to hit me harder. And I think when I survived, Reed adapted his strategy. Waited for me to rebuild the company, then recruited Eric to destroy it from the inside so he could profit from a bigger collapse. The words hung in the air between them, too large and too dark to take back. Ben didn't dismiss them. Didn't tell her she was being paranoid or seeing patterns that weren't there. He just sat with the information, processing it the way he processed everything, methodically and carefully. Can you prove it? Not yet. But if Miguel testifies about his arrangement with Eric, if Eric testifies about his arrangement with Reed, the connections might lead back to 2014. And if they do, I'm going to find Jason Mills and ask him who paid him to get drunk and drive his car into mine. Ben reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple and direct and carried none of the awkward uncertainty that usually accompanied physical comfort. If it's true, if Reed did this to you, we'll find the proof. After Thursday. After you've done what you came here to do. She turned her hand over and gripped his, holding on for a moment that stretched longer than necessary before pulling away. I should sleep, or try to. I'll wake you at 7. She rolled back to the bedroom and transferred to the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the dark thinking about Silas Reed, about Jason Mills, about a drunk driver who might have been paid to steal 11 years of her life. The rage she felt was clean and sharp and wholly different from what she felt toward Eric. Eric had betrayed friendship and trust. Reed had tried to kill her because she was in the way of his profit margin. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from James Whitfield, evidence reviewed. You have my vote. 9 confirmed votes. She had reached her threshold. Whatever happened Thursday, she had enough support to force the audit authorization through. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was already racing toward morning, toward the boardroom, toward the moment when she would stand in front of 14 people and either save her company or watch it burn. Wednesday morning arrived with clear skies and cold wind. Natalie woke at 6:30 to find Ben already in the kitchen, Emma eating cereal at the table. Emma looked up when she heard the wheels. Morning, Miss Natalie. Dad says today is your last day before the scary thing. That's right. Are you ready? Natalie rolled to the table and accepted the coffee Ben poured. I think so. Emma studied her with the serious expression of a child trying to understand something complicated. I put the drawing I made you in your folder yesterday. Did you see it? I did. Thank you, Emma. Good, because brave people help each other, and tomorrow you're going to need all the help you can get. The simple certainty in her voice made Natalie's chest tighten. She looked at this 9-year-old who had welcomed a stranger into her home and decided that stranger was worth protecting. And she understood something she had been too afraid to acknowledge before. She didn't want to leave this house. She didn't want to go back to the penthouse and the isolation and the carefully controlled life she had built around her disability. She wanted this. The kitchen table and the crayon drawings and the ordinary chaos of a family that functioned through love rather than perfection. Emma, after tomorrow, after everything is finished, would it be okay if I stayed here for a while longer? Emma's face lit up. Like you mean live here? Maybe, if your dad thinks it's a good idea. Emma turned to Ben with the demanding expression of a child who has just been given permission to want something. Dad, Miss Natalie wants to stay. That's okay, right? Ben met Natalie's eyes over his daughter's head. Something passed between them, a question and an answer, and an understanding that didn't require words. Yeah, that's okay. Emma jumped up and hugged Natalie hard enough that the wheelchair rocked slightly. This is the best day ever. Natalie hugged her back, feeling the weight of 11 years of loneliness lift just enough that she could breathe underneath it. When Emma finally let go and ran off to get ready for school, Natalie and Ben were left alone in the kitchen. You meant that? Ben's voice was quiet. I meant it. I don't know what my life looks like after tomorrow. I might not have a company to run. I might spend the next year testifying in federal court, but whatever happens, I don't want to do it alone anymore. Then you won't have to. The words settled between them, simple and permanent and completely terrifying. Natalie had spent 11 years building walls around herself, and Ben had just walked through every single one of them without even trying. Her phone rang. Her attorney. The statement went out yesterday, and we're already seeing positive response. Investors are viewing you as proactive rather than reactive. Stock is down 12% overall, but analysts are saying it could have been worse. What about the postponement effort? I've heard from 3 board members who are resisting it. Eleanor Whitmore called me personally this morning to say she's circulating a counter-petition insisting the meeting proceed as scheduled. You have momentum. Good, keep pushing. The day passed in a blur of final preparations. Natalie reviewed the presentation one last time, checking every citation, every piece of evidence, every argument she would need to counter Eric's defenses. Ben went to work for a half shift, returning at noon, with the news that building security at Sentinel headquarters had been increased even further. Extra guards enhanced surveillance, restricted floor access for anyone not on the executive roster. Eric's preparing for war, Ben said. Let him prepare. I'm ready. That evening, Owen Price called. I signed the witness affidavit. My attorney is filing it with federal prosecutors tomorrow morning. Once the board authorizes the audit, I'll testify to everything I know. Thank you, Owen. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Eric Drexler is in prison and those 11 people know that someone finally listened. Natalie ended the call and added Owen's affidavit to the master file. 10 confirmed votes. Miguel's recorded confession. Owen's testimony. 720 pages of documentation. She had built a case that Eric couldn't deflect and a coalition he couldn't break. All that remained was to walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning and deliver it. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with Ben and Emma eating dinner and talking about Emma's science project and Ben's work schedule and everything except what was coming in 12 hours. When Emma went to bed, Natalie and Ben cleaned up in comfortable silence, falling into the rhythm they had developed over the past week. I have something for you. Ben pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Emma's not the only one who can draw. Natalie unfolded it. It wasn't a drawing. It was a handwritten note in Ben's careful print. Whatever happens tomorrow, you already won. You stood up when it was easier to stay down. That's what matters. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her presentation folder next to Emma's drawing. Thank you. Get some sleep. Tomorrow changes everything. She tried. She rolled into the bedroom and transferred to the bed, lying in the dark and listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, Emma was dreaming about science projects and soccer games and a future that included a woman in a wheelchair who had stumbled into her life and decided to stay. Somewhere in the city, Eric Drexler was preparing his own defense building, his own arguments, making calls to board members who might still be swayed. And somewhere in Natalie's chest, underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the weight of everything she was about to do, was something she hadn't felt in 11 years. Hope. At 6 a.m. Thursday morning, she woke to the sound of rain starting again. Ben knocked on her door at 6:15, earlier than planned. You're awake. Couldn't sleep. Neither could I. He came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. I need to tell you something before you go into that boardroom. Natalie pushed herself up, suddenly alert. What is it? I called Garrett last night, told him everything that's happening today. He wanted you to know that the safety report he filed in 2020, the one about the HVAC modifications, included photographs of the system configurations. He kept copies. If you need physical evidence to prove Eric ordered those modifications, Garrett has it. Why didn't he mention that before? Because he's been terrified for 2 years that if he said anything, Eric would come after him again. But after hearing that you're actually doing this, that you're going to stand up in front of the board and present evidence he wants to help, he said to tell you that some things matter more than being safe. Natalie felt her throat tighten. Thank you for telling me. There's something else. Emma wanted to give you this. Ben held out a small object. It was a plastic toy horse, the kind that came in cereal boxes and got played with until the paint wore off. It's her favorite. She says it's for good luck. You're supposed to keep it in your pocket. Natalie took the horse carefully, feeling the weight of a 9-year-old's faith in her hands. I'll bring it back. She knows. She said you're brave enough not to need it, but it's nice to have something to hold on to anyway. They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who had found each other in the middle of a crisis and discovered something that might last beyond it. Then Ben stood and helped her transfer to the wheelchair, and they moved through the morning routine together. Coffee, breakfast, the quiet preparation for a day that would change everything. At 8:15, Natalie was dressed in the suit she had brought from her penthouse, her presentation loaded onto a tablet, Emma's drawing and Ben's note, and the plastic horse tucked into her folder. Emma hugged her goodbye at the front door, whispering, "You're going to do great," with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted it. Ben drove her to Sentinel headquarters. They didn't talk much during the drive. There wasn't much left to say. When they pulled up to the building, Natalie saw the extra security immediately. Guards at every entrance, cameras everywhere, the whole place locked down like a fortress. Ben came around and helped her out of the car. "I'll be waiting right here when you're done, however long it takes. It might be hours. I've got time." She rolled toward the entrance, passing through 3 security checkpoints before reaching the executive elevators. The ride to the 42nd floor felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, she rolled into a corridor that was completely empty, except for one person. Eric Drexler stood outside the boardroom doors, perfectly composed, in an expensive suit, looking like a man who had never committed a crime in his life. "Natalie, I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk before this started." She rolled past him without slowing. "We have nothing to talk about. I'm offering you one last chance to reconsider. We can work this out quietly. I'll resign, you can restructure finance, and we both walk away without destroying everything." She stopped and turned to face him. "You had 11 people harmed to protect your fraud. You paid Miguel Santos to tamper with building systems that nearly killed Alicia Morgan. You tried to destroy Garrett Hale's career when he flagged safety violations you wanted suppressed. And you just threatened me 2 days ago with federal prosecution if I didn't back down. You don't get to pretend this can be worked out quietly." Eric's expression hardened. "You're going to regret this." "I've regretted a lot of things in my life. Stopping you won't be one of them." She rolled through the boardroom doors and into the space where 14 people were already seated around a long table. The room fell silent when she entered. She could feel every eye on her, could sense the tension that came from people who knew they were about to witness something significant, but didn't yet know which way it would break. Eleanor Whitmore, seated at the far end of the table, gave her a small nod. Robert Kincaid looked nervous but steady. Patricia Monroe appeared on the video screen, broadcasting from San Francisco with a professional neutrality that revealed nothing. Natalie positioned herself at the head of the table. Eric took his seat on the opposite end, and for a moment they looked at each other across the length of polished wood and everything it represented. The board chair called the meeting to order. Natalie took a breath, felt the plastic horse in her pocket and the weight of Emma's drawing in her folder, and began. "Thank you all for being here. What I'm about to present represents 10 months of investigation into financial irregularities within Sentinel security systems. The evidence shows systematic fraud totaling $295 million coordinated by our CFO, Eric Drexler, with the assistance of 2 board members. I'm requesting an immediate vote to authorize an independent audit, suspend Mr. Drexler's authority, and report these findings to federal investigators." She pulled up the first slide and started walking them through it. The shell companies, the falsified audits, the offshore accounts, the email chains connecting Eric to Richard Wolff and Diana Foster. Every piece of evidence laid out in sequence, building toward a conclusion that became more undeniable with each passing minute. Eric tried to interrupt twice. Both times, Eleanor Whitmore shut him down with parliamentary procedure. The rules were clear. Natalie had the floor until her presentation was complete. She moved into the operational evidence, the 11 victims, the pattern of incidents correlating with access to sensitive financial data, Miguel Santos's recorded confession about being paid to tamper with building systems, Garrett Hale's safety report with photographic evidence of HVAC modifications that Eric had ordered suppressed. 32 minutes into the presentation, she played Miguel's recording. The room listened in complete silence as Miguel's voice described 3 years of being paid to access restricted areas, modify systems, disable cameras. When the recording ended, Richard Wolff's face had gone gray. Natalie continued. Owen Price's testimony about the compliance violations, the pattern of performance reviews being weaponized against anyone who questioned the financial reporting, the registered legal agent connecting the shell companies to board members who had profited from the fraud. At 41 minutes, she reached the final section. "I want to acknowledge my own failures in this matter. I signed off on subsidiary valuations without adequate review. I delegated Garrett Hale's safety report to Mr. Drexler without following up on his flagged concerns. I trusted systems I should have been auditing and trusted people I should have been questioning. Those failures are mine, and I accept full responsibility for them. But negligence is not the same as fraud. I failed to catch what Mr. Drexler was doing. He chose to do it, and I'm here today to make sure those choices have consequences. She closed the presentation and looked at the 14 faces around the table. I'm calling for 3 votes. First, authorization for an immediate independent audit with full access to all financial records. Second, suspension of Mr. Drexler's authority pending the completion of that audit. Third, mandatory reporting to the SEC and FBI of all findings. I need 9 votes on each measure to proceed. The board chair looked at Eric. Mr. Drexler, you have the opportunity to respond. Eric stood. He looked calm, controlled, and completely confident. What you've just heard is a carefully constructed narrative designed to deflect attention from systemic management failures at the executive level. Ms. Harlow has been under immense pressure running this company, and I believe that pressure has led her to see malicious intent where there are simply accounting complexities she doesn't fully understand. Eleanor Whitmore cut him off. Mr. Drexler, we just listened to a recorded confession from a maintenance worker you paid to tamper with building systems. We reviewed emails where you explicitly directed the creation of shell companies to hide embezzled funds. This isn't about accounting complexity. This is about documented criminal activity. Eric's composure cracked slightly. Those documents can be interpreted multiple ways. The shell companies were legitimate corporate structures. The maintenance work was authorized security monitoring. Ms. Harlow has taken ordinary business activities and twisted them into a conspiracy theory because she needs someone to blame for her own oversight failures. Robert Kincaid spoke up. I've reviewed the financial documentation. The shell company structures are identical to patterns used in 3 documented securities fraud cases in the past decade. This isn't ordinary business activity. The board chair called for the first vote. Authorization for independent audit. All in favor. Natalie counted the hands. Eleanor, Robert, Patricia, on screen, Thomas Granger, Linda Hartley, James Whitfield, 3 others she had contacted over the past week. 10 hands. Motion carries. Mr. Drexler, your authority is suspended effective immediately pending the completion of the independent audit. Security will escort you from the building. Eric stood slowly. He looked at Natalie across the table, and his expression was no longer confident. It was cold and calculating, and promised that this wasn't over. You just destroyed this company. No, I saved it. Security entered and escorted Eric from the room. Richard Wolfe and Diana Foster sat frozen in their seats, understanding that their own involvement would be uncovered the moment the audit began. The board chair continued through the remaining votes. Both passed with the same 10-vote majority. When the meeting adjourned, Natalie sat alone at the table for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She had done it. She had presented the evidence, secured the votes, and set in motion a process that would either restore Sentinel or reveal just how deep the corruption went. Eleanor Whitmore approached her chair. That took courage. It took 10 months and a lot of help. Nevertheless, you did what needed to be done. Eleanor paused. The next few months are going to be difficult. The audit will uncover things we'd rather not know. The stock will suffer. Employees will be scared. But you gave us a chance to fix this the right way, and that matters. Natalie nodded. She rolled out of the boardroom and into the elevator, descending 42 floors to the lobby, where Ben was waiting exactly where he said he would be. How did it go? It's done. The audit is authorized. Eric is out. The investigation starts tomorrow. Ben smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. Then you did it. We did it. They drove back to the house in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of people carrying separate burdens, but the silence of people who had carried something heavy together and could finally set it down. Emma was waiting on the front porch when they pulled into the driveway. She ran to the car before Natalie was even out, her face anxious. Did you win? Natalie handed her the plastic horse. We won. Thank you for the good luck. Emma threw her arms around Natalie's neck, and Natalie held her close, feeling something that might have been the beginning of healing. That night, after dinner and homework and Emma's bedtime, Natalie and Ben sat on the porch watching the neighborhood settle into evening quiet. She thought about tomorrow when the audit would begin and federal investigators would start asking questions. She thought about the media coverage and the investor panic and the long, difficult process of rebuilding trust. She thought about Silas, Reed, and Jason Mills and the investigation she still needed to pursue into whether her accident had been orchestrated. But mostly she thought about this: the porch and the quiet, and the man sitting beside her who had given her sanctuary when she needed it most. What happens now? Ben's voice was quiet. Now I rebuild. The company, my reputation, my life. All the things I let fall apart while I was chasing evidence and running from fear. You don't have to do it alone. I know. She reached over and took his hand. I don't want to. They sat like that as the sun went down and the streetlights came on, and somewhere in the city a story was beginning to break that would change everything. But here on this porch in this moment, Natalie Harlow felt something she hadn't felt in 11 years. She felt like she was home. The federal trial of Eric Drexler and Silas Reed concluded on a Thursday in April. Eric received 18 years for securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Reed received 22 for the same charges plus attempted murder after investigators found evidence linking him to both Natalie's 2014 accident and a payment to Jason Mills that Mills ultimately confessed to receiving. Richard Wolff and Diana Foster accepted plea agreements in exchange for testimony. Both received reduced sentences of 6 and 7 years respectively. Sentinel's stock recovered within 8 months, rising 41% above pre-scandal levels as investors rewarded the company's transparency and accountability. Natalie remained CEO, implementing new oversight structures and bringing Owen Price in as Chief Compliance Officer. Garrett Hale testified at the trial and received a settlement from Sentinel covering his medical expenses and disability costs. He and Ben started a safety consulting firm specializing in building systems integrity. Alicia Morgan returned to Boston and accepted a position in Sentinel's restructured finance division, reporting directly to Natalie. And in a small house in Dorchester, Emma Callahan's science project on the solar system won first place at her school's fair. The project included a dedication for Miss Natalie, who taught me that brave people help each other. Natalie kept the dedication on her desk at Sentinel headquarters, next to a photograph of 3 people standing in front of a house smiling like they knew exactly where they belonged.